If you got people that are willing to like go through SEAL training, they're usually pretty ballsy dudes. And it's kind of like the barrier to like trying something like that just goes down with the more, you know, aggressive and crazier the people are. So
in the book, you actually show the heaviest stack that you ever did.
Yep.
What was your opinions about taking roids then, and then how do you feel about them now?
What's up, guys? Derek, moreplaysmoredates.com. Today we're going to be talking about Dan Bilzerian's steroid usage again. This is a topic I actually covered way back in, I think it was I don't even know. I have a blog article up. Let's see, when was it? It was in 2018. So this was Dan Bilzerian Steroid Cycle Revealed, a deep dive analysis. Basically, he's pretty transparent about his anabolic use and always has been. Even in college, I had one of my closest friends went to college with him, and they trained together and would talk about juice quite openly. And like, the guy's been pretty fucking transparent since day one about gear. However, you know, what is the biggest cycle he's ever done? That is something I don't think he's ever talked about openly, at least, you know, on some like podcast or like in a public forum. Rather than just like telling his buddies or whatever. So back in 2018, he basically revealed what his current stack was at the time, which ultimately is, as you would expect, just like, you know, TRT on paper. Like his total T is going to be, you know, within range. However, you know, have a disproportionately high free, and it's going to help him retain more muscle than the average guy and recover better, because ultimately you are not, you know, having a detriment to your test levels when you have shitty sleep, when you go party, when you do whatever it is. And you're maintaining that level perpetually around the clock without worrying about a diurnal rhythm or any kind of pulsatile secretions that are dependent on diet, sleep, perfect fucking lifestyle, etc. So he's basically functioning on like a perpetual, not like cycle, but, you know, like ultimately TRT is going to yield you some performance enhancing advantage above and beyond like what you would actually get from the same total T level naturally produced out of your ball sack. So back in 2018, he basically just replied to a guy's DM, said, answering a lot of DMs, easier to post this. This guy asked, what supplements do you use, Dan, and what's the workout plan? Thanks. And then he basically said what kind of subs he uses, his protein, Cialis for pump, 100 milligrams of test every 5 days, 1 IUGH, 45 minutes of sun, and a shot of noni every morning, 25 grams protein every 3 hours, low glycemic index carbs and vegetables. No sugar, no dairy, no processed foods. I train chest, back, legs, arms, slash. So basically he would have a chest and back day, leg day, arms, shoulders, calves, day off, repeat. First 3 days I go heavy, 7 and 12 reps. Second, 3 lighter, 10 to 15 rep sets, 45 to 50 minutes of cardio every other day. And, oh shit, I guess this was removed. Like, he has a good physique, you know, no one's doubting that. And in this video, I basically just, you know, discussed basically what I just summarized, you know, why TRT would be able to allow you, or at least this level of TRT would yield some disproportionate advantage from a recovery aspect above and beyond what your balls are naturally capable of doing for you at the same total T level. I got into, you know, the Cialis use. I got into, you know, the harm reduction in terms of why he probably doesn't push the anabolics hard anymore, given that he is an individual who has experienced heart attacks in the past. Basically dived into, you know, all that kind of stuff and dug through some of his historical shit as far as referencing his body composition metrics, how they've changed over the years, longitudinal data, the deployment of HGH, Cialis in a, you know, performance enhancing aspect, like why he would be doing it, potential blood pressure modulation, pretty much everything in this video. This is one of the first celebrity steroid cycle videos I ever did. And it was a pretty well-received video. And this is actually what he used to look like back in his 20s. And this is, you know, the more recent shot. And he's basically maintained a similar physique for over a decade at this point, because, you know, like ultimately nothing's really changing that significantly. But obviously when he was younger, he pushed the envelope a little bit harder and built up the foundation. And he sort of just like, you know, maintains what he can now. From what I can tell. So more recently, he's been going on a podcast spree to promote his new book called The Setup. And he's been on an array of different podcasts, and some of them discuss his steroid usage. And one of the main things they're talking about in these podcasts, and is a chapter in the book, is about smuggling steroids in his ass back into the States, or just using it in Mexico and getting jabbed with it while he's there, and how many people in SEAL training were doing this to get, a leg up, a competitive advantage, to, enhance their recovery, to basically accommodate, get a heightened level of stress resilience, be able to tolerate, the shitty lack of sleep, like all that kind of stuff. Obviously, steroids would be hugely beneficial from a recovery aspect in that kind of a environment. So in Impulsive, the podcast particularly, they discuss his current TRT regimen, and then it sort of tangents into another podcast where they discuss like the biggest cycle ever. We'll get into that shortly.
Are you currently taking? I had a little run where I was getting some of those test shots in my ass every fucking week, and I didn't like the idea of starting in my mid 30s, so I kind of stopped. But are you taking tests? Like, what kind of things are you using?
Yeah, so I started taking tests, man, in my fucking 20s, and I basically kind of like started treating it like HRT.
Yep.
So I didn't take a lot, but I just stayed on. So yeah, I've been on tests, low doses, but.
What's your dose?
I was doing 100 milligrams every 5 days, and then I moved it to every 4 days. So pretty fucking low, but enough to where you feel, like you're 20 years old.
You know what your level is about?
It varies. I do blood work pretty regularly. It's around like 900.
The range is 350 to like 800. So like you're definitely at the highest.
No, it's not. It's 400. It's 400.
Mike gets fucking quickly corrected that even if you have a 900, it's not like that's some staggering level. Like that's, decent production, but it's not necessarily indicative of you're going to grow way better than the next guy who has, a 600. Like ultimately a lot of muscle growth comes down to AR content, other downstream cascades of hormones and processes that induce satellite cell proliferation, myonuclear donation, a bunch of shit that is, outside the scope of how much test is circulating in your bloodstream at the time of a blood draw. So like having a 900 on paper and a disproportionately high free, like it's not like this is obscene, this is nothing, crazy. He is going to have a disproportionately higher free from the likely lower amount of binding protein as a result of pinning his ass with exogenous androgens. That's not 100% the case, but in general, you see disproportionately higher frees in guys who are using TRT in general. And above and beyond that, the main point is that it is maintaining itself long-term with no dips, no fucking, up and downs with a diurnal rhythm. It is a stable bleed of hormone, regardless of what you do, what you don't do in your lifestyle, etc. So obviously you're going to retain a bit more muscle and have a bit more of a recovery advantage, a bit more, psychoactive components of it, etc. All from this, this TRT deployment. So his dose is quite reasonable and the total T is normal despite, Mike's bewilderment.
12 to 1200.
Like Tyron Woodley was like 1100
Got
or something.
But to be at 900 is not super common. Like, do you know what yours is?
It was 500 the last time I got
and I'm about 530. Yeah.
I mean, it declines with age, and I think it's like genetic. I think black guys have higher tests.
Okay.
For sure. I think it's like a genetic thing. And yeah, it helps, man. It's not something that, is something to fucking look over. I mean, it's a big deal. I mean, it's your recovery. It's, putting on muscle. It's a whole fucking, lot of things. And so I think once you start declining, I mean, most of my friends that are like 40 and over, they're just on.
Just getting the shots. And I think people like on the Rogan side and stuff like that, they're all running it too. I don't know if Goggins does, but like,
I don't think he does, but he fucking should. It's so strange to me, guys like that are like so into fitness, and this is such a fucking edge. I guess with him, it doesn't surprise me as much because, he doesn't do any drugs. But guys that are out there like snorting coke and doing ecstasy, it's like, why the fuck would you not do fucking tests? It's like, here's something that's gonna like, especially like super into fitness, right? You're like doing all these drugs that are fucking you up. You're not gonna do like the one that's gonna give you some like positive.
Does it feel like cheating? Doesn't matter.
For me, I've been a whatever it takes kind of guy.
Okay, so he kind of talks about his, TRT usage and whatnot. But before that, way back, in his heyday, again, when he was in SEAL training, he was just using whatever he could get his hands on, and literally whatever he could get up his ass apparently too. But he actually talks about in his book how the first thing he used actually was ReadyJect Deca shots, and he would basically go get like a fucking 18 gauge harpoon shoved in his ass with like a 50 milligram per milliliter nandrolone decanoate solution, which was fucking brutal, dude. Like, imagine doing Deca monotherapy at a low dosage and having to shove like a fucking goddamn harpoon into your ass every single time. Like, an 18 is no fucking joke and totally unnecessary, obviously. But having that low of a concentration per milliliter would be like the fucking worst thing ever. But he did what he could get a hold of, and that was his first kind of foray into anabolics exposure. And eventually he ends up talking about, his biggest cycle too. And this is, I thought I was just listening to the thing about how prevalent it was in SEAL training and whatnot, and his experience in it. And that's when this came up in this podcast, which kind of like notified me that he goes over his biggest stack in the book. And I was like,
No,
Oh, absolutely.
a lot of other guys.
Well, I went down there with a bunch of other guys.
Yeah,
We were all
okay. So
smuggling it back. So yes,
So the idea that guys were taking roids during SEAL training is not that's something that was new to me. I had no idea.
yeah, I didn't either until I went in, but I think it's true of a lot of like special forces. I mean, it makes sense, right? I mean, you're training, you're doing crazy shit. It's high adrenaline. It's it's risky profession. So I mean, people that are less risk averse and that are in those things and also like really care about fitness and like being in good shape and looking good and whatever, like those are all naturally the people that are going to be prone to be juicing the most anyways. And so if you got people that are willing to like go through SEAL training, they're usually pretty ballsy dudes. And it's kind of like the barrier to like trying something like that just goes down with the more, aggressive and crazier the people are. So
In the book, you actually show the heaviest stack that you ever did.
So that was where I was like, okay, I gotta go see what this is. So I go check it out, and it's actually not as crazy as you would imagine. Like, he's actually been, if this is legitimate, been relatively responsible, given that there was no information about this back then. Really, like, you were dealing with guys like Dan Duchesne putting out like newsletters and shit, or like random publications, but no like YouTube channels, not really any books to really reference, like very minimal literature on it, no forums, no fucking anything. So the fact that I don't know if it's just his heart attacks that made him be so conservative, because he had his heart attacks like quite early. I imagine that played into it quite significantly. But even from day one, like, in SEALs training, and perhaps this was just lack of access as well, but his heaviest cycle is pretty, not that crazy. It was, I'll give a preface here. He says, if you don't give a fuck and you want a performance advantage or you have shit genetics, he has like a section in the book about steroid usage, then I would recommend doing a lot of research before you start a cycle. Always err on the side of doing less. The risk versus reward of doing really high doses is rarely worth it. The heaviest cycle I ever did was 100 milligrams of testosterone and 200 milligrams of equipoise every 3 days. So boldenone, undeslinate, and testosterone with a undisclosed ester. So you're looking at 600 milligrams a week at that point, which is not very much. 1 milligram of Arimidex every 3 days. Now, do you need 1 milligram of Arimidex when you're using twice as much boldenone as you are testosterone? Probably not. The competition for aromatase is quite significant with boldenone at exceedingly proportional dosages to testosterone. So you can imagine that your E2 would probably actually be pretty fucking low when you're on test and EQ. So I highly doubt that Arimidex was necessary, but to each his own. Some people are going to, aromatize at different rates, perhaps even have, different amounts of fucking test making it through versus EQ. And, individual response will vary, but ultimately test is going to aromatize into estradiol. EQ is going to aromatize into some undisclosed synthetic estrogen analog that is less potent in a estrogen receptor agonism context and likely will be less sufficient for a, like bioidentical base. So when you're competing for aromatase with these two drugs and you have EQ at double the burden, kind of like beating it out for aromatase occupying / aromatization, you're probably not going to need Arimidex. That's probably going to be overkill. But anyways, 3 IU of GH every day, decent dose, probably put his IG up if he has, normal growth factor production rates, or at least, like average, I would imagine 3 IU of high quality GH would put him in like borderline acromegaly territory. So you're looking at like probably super physiological levels of IGF-1, or at least like pretty fucking close for the majority of people. Again, it doesn't necessarily mean it's going to work better if your IGF-1 is higher than the next guy. I'm just kind of giving an example of like what kind of reflection you might see in your blood work to kind of show what this is even doing as far as downstream conversion. So 3 IU of GH is not like an anti-aging replacement dose, nor is it really like a high tier bodybuilder dose. It's somewhere in the middle, I would say. But it's not nothing. If that's high quality GH, it's, pretty fucking, solid dose. Like, when I say solid, I mean like, it's going to do some shit, It's going to be potent and actually produce, like bodybuilder level effects, just not like at a high level. Like, top bodybuilders are using more than this. But it's also not just like replacement. 10 milligrams of dianabol twice a day. So he has the full stack is 100 milligrams of test and 200 milligrams of EQ every 3 days. 1 milligram of the aromatase inhibitor or Arimidex every 3 days. So I guess presumably he does his shot and then he, pops into Arimidex to try and like deal with the test and the probably speculated EQ conversion, which, it does convert to fucking something. It's just, do you need Arimidex to deal with that kind of estrogen burden from the synthetic estrogen analog? Probably not, given its lack of potency. But anyways, 3 IU of GH every day and then 10 milligrams of dianabol twice a day. So again, this is another compound that's a substrate for aromatase and it actually will be competing with the test and EQ as well. So at that point, maybe it makes a bit more sense to have the Arimidex in there if you are estrogen prone. But again, like this is such a redundant cycle. Like this is, like ultimately you can tell not a lot of research has gone into it because frankly, there was nothing really available back in the day to reference. So you have 100 milligrams of test, which is, your functional base, boldenone, which is a testosterone derivative, but ultimately is going to, lower the estrogenic burden of test quite significantly. And it's kind of like phlebitic interactions are quite significant and potentially problematic in a context where it's not even better at muscle protein synthesis than another probably more benign compound like apremilast. So like EQ in general, especially with its long ester clearance as well, like frankly, it doesn't really have a place in a lot of cycles. Like it's very, very, very niched, context specific where it makes any logical sense whatsoever. But then above and beyond that, having 20 milligrams of dianabol a day on top of the EQ, which on paper, like they're like pretty much the same fucking drug essentially. And you already have a test base. Like, a lot of people who follow this channel are probably like, wow, that's like a fucking like bad cycle. You might want to choose something like a DHT derivative to stack on top of your test, like a Premone. Maybe if you're going to go to the progestogenic side, you look at a nandrolone, but ultimately stacking like redundant compounds that are kind of like the least ideal choices in this context specifically. Obviously the cycle is not ideal, but nonetheless, just giving my fucking analysis of it. And the heaviest cycle he ever did is, so 20 milligrams times 7, you're looking at 140 on top of his 600 of the test and EQ weekly burden. So you're looking at like, 740 milligrams a week, which is not very much, dude. That's like some people's beginner first fucking cycle is like 500 tests plus like 20 to 30 D-ball as a Kickstarter, which obviously is, overkill for sure. On your first cycle, obviously you don't need to be, kickstarting it with orals and shit. Like you don't even know how you respond to just test on its own. Test only is the fucking gold standard. So don't be kickstarting your shit with dianabol, nor do you need to be using like, this level of dosage burden per week on your first exposure. So not that he did not do that, by the way. I'm just saying this is his heaviest cycle ever. And I'm just saying that like I've seen people do that as their first cycle essentially, and it's definitely unnecessary. So anyways, 740 milligrams a week, quite responsible, I guess, given that it is ultimately the biggest thing he's ever done. Like most people have used anabolics have at some point used more than that, or at least, people who expose themselves prior to having any sort of high quality information access. Unfortunately, a lot of us in our first few cycles, use some dumb shit. He says as well, notably, testosterone is your base. It is essential for sexual function and mental state. You can add anabolics, but you should never do a cycle with just an anabolic like Deca or Winstrol unless you don't want your dick to work. So is that necessarily accurate? with Deca on its own or Winstrol on its own, depending on the dosage, like obviously if you have a DHT derivative in there on its own, you're gonna have no estrogen conversion whatsoever because it's competing for aromatase, but it's not a substrate for aromatase, so you're not going to really have any estrogen analogs being produced that are going to have any sort of estrogen receptor interaction whatsoever. You're suppressing yourself via the HPTA negative feedback. Ultimately, you're going to be functioning with lower androgenic activity because you're using a anabolic androgenic steroid, which is more tissue selective than testosterone and downstream DHT. And you have no Winstrol's not going to convert to estrogen, so you have no estrogen base whatsoever. You're going to feel like shit. You have dry, brittle joints on top of the Winstrol effects. Just bad, Now with Deca though, obviously it's a bit of a different story where there is, it is a substrate for aromatase and it produces some, estrone, estradiol. I have more elaborate videos when this was a very heavily researched topic in my channel a couple of years ago. I recommend checking out my Deca only cycle Bloodwork, where I actually dug into some of the high sensitivity analysis of estrogen metabolites and whatnot as a result of nandrolone only exposure and some of the kind of conclusions I made from using that compound on its own. But this is kind of a rule of thumb that in general is relatively correct when he says you can add anabolics, but you should never do a cycle of just an anabolic like Deca or Winstrol unless you don't want your dick to work. The converse is true as well. You should never just do large doses of testosterone by itself. Combining an anabolic will give better results with a lower incidence of side effects, low doses. So, he's basically saying use a tolerable amount of test, to fulfill physiologic functions and, add anabolics on top to drive muscle protein synthesis above and beyond, your base essentially, because that is ultimately what those drugs were designed to do with a relative lack of the side effect burden that may come from excessive amounts of testosterone aromatizing, 5-alpha reducing, etc. It is a relatively logical approach to cycle design. I don't entirely disagree with it, although there is obviously niche scenarios and contexts where this is, inaccurate, but ultimately in general, this is the way cycle design sort of makes sense. And that a lot of us have been taught over the years that, how it sort of would work. He also says low doses of HCG are typically administered during or at the end of the cycle to get your nuts producing testosterone again and to prevent testicular atrophy. There's a plethora of information out there, so don't be lazy, do your research and make informed decision. Talk to a hormone replacement doctor, but keep in mind most doctors don't know jack shit about juicing. So do your homework and find one who does. Be responsible, get your blood work done frequently, use proper sterilization techniques, and only take what your doctor prescribes. Black market drugs can be mislabeled, unsterile, and inaccurately dosed. So ultimately, I definitely agree with that statement entirely. And he actually has some anecdotes in his book here about, abscesses that he developed as a result of not sterile shit and things that, went wrong and awry in his steroid exposure escapades and whatnot. So definitely interesting. And I was actually a little bit surprised. I was expecting the heaviest cycle to be far more substantial. The guy is obviously a relatively risk-taking individual. He has no aversion to risk. And I would have imagined the guy had done at least at one point a couple grams of shit, but it does not seem to be the case. And frankly, I have no reason to not believe him in this aspect. Obviously he could be saying this to prevent people from doing more than he would want them to be doing. But ultimately this, he seems pretty, transparent about his anabolics at least. And I was expecting more. So anyways, that is it. That's his heaviest cycle. And it seems like now he's just on TRT as he has been for multiple years and kind of just chilling, using a little bit of GH for, anti-aging, if you can call it that, at a replacement amount, plus keeping his test at high normal essentially and functioning at a high natural level essentially. So thank you guys for watching. Like, subscribe, comment, check out my blog, moreplatemordates.com. Follow me on Instagram at moreplatemordates, Facebook, Snapchat, Twitter, TikTok, Apple Podcasts. If you want to support the channel, you can check out anything I'm associated with in the video description below. My TRT clinic, all telemedicine from the comfort of your own home. If you want to get a high quality doctor, kind of like Dan mentioned, having somebody in your camp who actually understands endocrinology, pharmacology, fucking critical in my opinion, especially to attenuate the potential damage of exogenous anabolics. If you're going to be using super physiological dosages, having somebody who understands the renin, angiotensin, aldosterone system, someone who understands blood pressure modulation, someone who understands cardiac hypertrophy, the risks you're exposing yourself to when you use this shit. Definitely critical to have somebody in your camp who is assessing your longitudinal data and keeping you safe. Or if you're just an individual looking for high level TRT or an individual who even wants to stay natural and just wants a high quality doctor in your camp who will oversee you and make sure you are at the highest level of function possible and everything looks on point. There's no aberrations in your biomarkers that are, worrisome or could be leading to detriment to your performance or your quality of life. Definitely recommend checking out my clinic. The doctors are vetted in all of this shit, and it is something that I am very, very proud to bring to the public because this is something I wish I had access to when I was first getting into this stuff. So definitely check it out, as well as anything else I'm associated with. Gorilla Mind, nootropic formulas, Gorilla Mode, pre-workout formulas, design myself from scratch, my recommended diet model for gaining muscle and sports performance, as well as anything else I'm associated with. It is all in the video description below. Thank you guys for watching. Talk to you soon.